Well, here we go. I'm going to talk about carbon monoxide today, the chemical symbol CO, not to be confused with CO2, which some people do out in the real world. They'll say, I have a CO2 detector in my home, and for sure it's not. It's a CO detector. I subtitled this Dangers and Detectors. I want to especially focus on the dangers. The detectors, there's hundreds out there. You can read the manuals, the instructions that come with the detectors, but I will mention a few, and then this is me, I'm Rod. Okay, now I'd like to give you a little preview of what this video will present. Talk about normal room air, the gases that are present. You'll be surprised at the percent, I have a feeling. A lot of emphasis on the biology of carbon monoxide and how it interacts with hemoglobin. It's terrible to think about. Hemoglobin would rather bind to carbon monoxide than oxygen, and that's one of the main things that makes it so wicked. All mammals have hemoglobin, so CO will kill everything in the house that's a mammal. It probably won't kill cockroaches, right? They're going to last forever. But anyway, dogs, cats, people. And remember, I'm looking at mammals only, but there's a lot of vertebrates that have hemoglobin as well. We'll talk about tables that are out there in the real world. They make a good point about certain levels of carbon monoxide in homes and when do symptoms start appearing and how long till death. And I've got an example of that. 1,600 parts per million brings about death in 1 hour. Then elevated dangers in hotels and resorts. This has been in the news a lot. People check into a hotel, a resort. They all die. Some of them die. I'm going to talk about that. But hotels and resorts present elevated dangers over your home, for sure. A little discussion of CO detectors, and then I'm going to, at the end, say you must travel with CO detectors. I don't care if it's within the United States, other countries. If you're in France listening to this, you should travel with CO detectors, the ones that are appropriate for where you're traveling to. Okay, now we're ready to tell you about what's in normal room air. This would be in your house, in a school, in a court room, whatever. So the question is, what is the content of normal air? I think I just grabbed this off the internet. By quantity of molecules dry air contains, we always say 78% nitrogen. You might say, what in the world? Well, it's basically an inert substance, and it's not going to really interact with your body, but it's 78% nitrogen. Then we have 21% oxygen, and that's a good figure to remember. Normal air has 21% oxygen, maybe just slightly under. I have a oxygen detector that I teach about, and it always reads 20.9% in most of the rooms that I go to. Then the other gases are very minor, but almost 1% argon, very tiny amount of carbon dioxide, and then there's tiny amounts of trace gases. For example, unfortunately, some homes have radon as a trace gas that's radioactive, but I'm not talking about that today. Okay, now I want to get into the biology of carbon monoxide and hemoglobin. It is odorless, colorless, tasteless, and I could have added at the end a non-irritant. It doesn't irritate you either with like your eyes. So I call it the perfect devil's gas. Humans cannot detect carbon monoxide with their own senses. That's what makes detectors that you buy so important. I mean, they are just incredibly important. Now, if we look at the density of air compared to carbon monoxide, if we set air at 1, and you know, if you are a purist, you could look up the density of air, and it's usually given, I'll just say this right now, 1.28 kilograms per cubic meter. But most of us don't care about that. If we know that the density of air is 1, and then we compare carbon monoxide to it, the density of CO is 0.967, and you know what? That's close enough to being equal. For all practical purposes, it is equal, and that means carbon monoxide will totally freely disperse in the air in the room, and wherever the air is flowing, so will carbon monoxide. It's going to mix totally freely. So that's another thing that happens. If the air current is flowing and there's CO in there, it's going to be a slave to the air current, and it's going to follow the air. If it was extremely light or extremely heavy, it might sit at the ceiling or sit on the floor and not travel around. But this is another thing that makes it dangerous. I didn't put a lot of symptoms of CO toxicosis in this video. I do have one table, but you can look them up. A lot of times they'll talk about flu-like symptoms, headaches. It just depends on what parts per million you're exposed to and then how long you've been exposed to that. But I know here's one example. Now remember, the detectors read out parts per million, and we'll find out that 1,600 parts per million will cause death in 1 hour. So that's the final symptom, isn't it? And if you're in a room and you go to sleep, you won't have any of those symptoms. You'll just slowly die of asphyxiation, because we'll show you the biology. Then, of course, there's sources of carbon monoxide, and a lot of people don't appreciate it, but anything that contains carbon and it's burned, it's never 100% efficiency, so there's going to be some CO produced, I should say. Cars produce it, those generators that you rent or buy when there's a power outage, anything gas stove, water heaters, not the electric ones, but anything that has fuel, natural gas, whatever. And unfortunately, sometimes because of the airflow, the source can be your neighbor's house. I'll tell you one example about that happened in England. A basement hot water heater was spewing out CO, and the air current was such that it leaked out of the basement and into the neighbor's basement where there was a bedroom, and the person died in that basement bedroom because of the CO that was leaking from I think it was a hot water heater next door. You know how sometimes houses are very close together? Okay, so now we're getting into some of the fun stuff, at least how to understand it. And I titled this Biology of CO and Hemoglobin. And in my drawing here, thanks for graphic packages, I don't have to rely on my own non-artistic skills. The red line here depicts a red blood cell. Red blood cells are round and they're like a disc, and they contain hemoglobin molecules. And each hemoglobin molecule, think of it as 4 seats. Think of it as one car, and there's 4 seats that things can sit in there. But only certain things can fit in there. Vitamins can't, whatever. You got to diffuse through this membrane, first of all. And, hemoglobin is made, and its main purpose, of course, in normal cases, is to fill up the seats with oxygen. Now, down here, I put down that red blood cells contain approximately 270 million hemoglobin molecules. So it's got 270 million of these in each red blood cell. I just drew one. And then if each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules, that's what these seats are for, then a single red blood cell can transport over 1 billion oxygen molecules. So that's important, because then when you breathe in air, that's 21% oxygen, you're going to deliver a lot of oxygen to your body. And we don't get into respiratory physiology, but when you take a breath in, the surface area that one breath spreads across in your lungs is amazing. Sometimes people say it's equal to half a tennis court, the surface area of half a tennis court. Every breath gets spread across that because everything is done by passive transfer in the lungs. Okay, so now we're still on the biology, and now I've got the red blood cell like before, of course, then hemoglobin, and I've got it occupied by 4 molecules of oxygen. And we know that oxygen diffuses into the red blood cell, diffuses out of the red blood cell, and when hemoglobin has oxygen attached, it's called oxyhemoglobin. I didn't spell that out, but it's just oxy and then hemoglobin. Yeah, so that's the normal case. Okay, now we're still on our 1 red blood cell example with a molecule of hemoglobin, but now I've got CO sitting in one of the seats. The other 3 seats are filled with oxygen, so let's say this is a low-level contamination in a house. But it's kind of interesting, even when 1 carbon monoxide sits there, it makes it harder for oxygen to be transported. Of course, now oxygen, once we get down to the tissue level, it's going to diffuse out into the tissue because the affinity there is very weak, and I've got a great example. The carbon monoxide is not really going to diffuse out into tissue. It's going to sit there because it's tightly bound to the hemoglobin. So it's just going to be circulating around and around the body, and as sites fill up, that means each circulation of blood will bring less and less oxygen to tissues like the brain, the heart, all the tissues basically. Okay, in this illustration, I've got all the sites, the 4 binding sites that normally would have oxygen in them, being occupied by CO, carbon monoxide. So this hemoglobin molecule is not going to carry any oxygen to the tissue. And remember, the CO is so tightly bound, it's not going to diffuse out, not much is going to diffuse out and poison tissue. So you don't die of CO poisoning in tissue, you die of lack of oxygen in tissue because this isn't carrying any oxygen. And this molecule, this compound I could call it now, the hemoglobin that has CO bound to it, is called carboxyhemoglobin. And remember, if it's got oxygen, it's called oxyhemoglobin. So, we could kind of cheat there, and that's the normal, but then when there's CO in those sites, it's called carboxyhemoglobin. And that does not carry any oxygen at all. And I should say that I've got oxygen out here in the bottom because there's no place for oxygen to go into the tissue, into the hemoglobin. So it's going to stay in the lungs. That's the other thing. It's not going to be transported to body tissues. Now I've added this paragraph, which I'm not going to read, but it's going to tell you how carbon dioxide is transported in blood. And it doesn't sit in those same sites that oxygen does. So it's a different kind of mechanism. It gets back to the lungs, and you can pause this and read it if you want, but I'm moving on. Now here's an analogy I'm pretty proud of because I wanted to talk about and compare the binding affinities of oxygen to hemoglobin and CO to hemoglobin. And you can think of it as the strength of attachment. Remember, everything is being diffused. Oxygen diffuses from the air spaces in the lungs across to the red blood cells, attaches to hemoglobin. Then when it gets to the big toe, it diffuses across to the toe tissue because its diffusion always goes from high to low concentrations, and it's a passive process. There's no pumps working. So down here, this little baby that I generated by AI represents oxygen and how it interacts with the binding sites. Carbon monoxide over here on the right is a Viking I generated by AI, and the 250 times represents how much tighter CO binds to hemoglobin compared to a molecule of O2. And this is one of the things most people don't understand. If it was a one-to-one thing, it wouldn't be so deadly. But the reason it's so deadly is that when it sits in one of those seats in hemoglobin, it's not going to give up the seat. In fact, it takes more than a day to get rid of all the CO that's in bound to hemoglobin for victims of fires and stuff. In a normal case, if they're breathing air, it'll take a whole day, 24 hours or more, to get rid of all the CO on their hemoglobin. Of course, we know that an antidote for CO toxicosis is 100% oxygen, and a lot of the fire departments will give that to the victims of home fires and stuff like that. Then if a person is really in bad shape, you try to find a hyperbaric chamber that the person can go into, and then that gives you oxygen at more than 1 atmosphere, and that helps get the CO off the hemoglobin. And so if you're breathing just pure oxygen, I think they say it takes 3 to 4 hours to get all the CO out of your hemoglobin. And if you're in a hyperbaric chamber, it probably takes a little less than that, maybe a couple hours. But this is my analogy, and this is a big point of why CO is so deadly. It sits in those seats on hemoglobin, and it says, I'm not moving. So I just wanted to explain all mammals are at risk because all mammals have hemoglobin, and the CO binds 250 times over oxygen. And of course, there's not always death involved, because we'll see this chart that's coming up. If it's a low level, you're going to be sick. There's been instances of a housewife that never left her home. The family left the home every morning, but she had flu-like symptoms for weeks. And every time she'd go to a physician, they would give her something for, a bacterial infection or whatever. And then finally a repairman that lived in the area heard that she had been sick for a while, and the family really wasn't, because they were coming back. And he took his little professional CO detector and said, man, you're living in an area with, it's not going to kill you, but it's going to make you sick. Now here's the thing, CO is extra dangerous when you talk about unborn babies. So that would be babies in utero, and that would be also any fetus in utero, whether your dog is pregnant or cat or whatever. And you might say, why are unborn babies more at risk? Well, their hemoglobin is even better at binding oxygen, but then also better at binding CO. Their affinity is more than regular. In all of us that are out here in the real world, well, we have adult hemoglobin, but babies have fetal hemoglobin. And then, of course, when a baby is born, there's still fetal hemoglobin around. So infants are at risk too, more than ordinary people, let's say. Elderly sometimes have respiratory dysfunction, heart problems. And so I'm just saying, dogs, cats, horses, you name the mammal, the mechanism that I just put out in those previous screens work for them too. And then when there's a high level of CO, now I put high in parentheses because they're not really that high. Even when there's a lot of CO in the room, in the house, there's still 21% oxygen in the air. So you know why that's a problem, because CO sits in the hemoglobin, doesn't give up its seats, and stays there for a long time. Well, I'm not going to read everything about this table because you can slowly read it. I'll slowly extend it up here. But you can see where it says 100 parts per million. After a couple hours, you're going to have a headache. Headache is one of the first signs, perhaps. 400 parts per million, serious headache after 1 to 2 hours. 800 parts per million, you get dizzy. They spelled that wrong. That's okay. And what's interesting is that 800 parts per million, death occurs within 2 to 3 hours. Then, and I'm going to calculate something with the 16 parts per million. But you can have death within 1 hour. Definitely after 20 minutes, you're going to have fast heart rate. You're going to be dizzy, headache. So it's amazing. 3,200 parts per million death within 1 hour. Then as you get up to 12,800 parts per million, you're going to be unconscious after 2 to 3 breaths. Why? Because all those sites on the hemoglobin are filling up with CO. Okay, now, you'll agree by now that 1,600 parts per million is high levels of carbon monoxide in a home. But let's put it in percent. And I want to make the point of CO is very dangerous at very low amounts. So over on the left there, I've got 1,600 over 1 million. That's how you could depict 1,600 parts per million. Now I've got it equaling to something over 100. That means I'm going to put something on top that says what percent it is. And let's see, I'm going to drag it over. There it is. So 16 parts per million, that you could read on a detector, that would be extremely high, is only 0.16% of the air. And I'm going to draw that out there, and I put it there percent because I can put it either over 100 or with the percent sign. So it's deadly at 0.16%. Remember, oxygen is 21%. So this is crazy. That's what makes it so dangerous, that 250 times affinity. It won't give up its seat, and it disperses with air, and it follows air currents. Okay, I titled this Elevated CO Danger in Hotels and Resorts. And it's true. If you look at the past reports, sometimes those resorts, hotels, don't have any CO detectors. What? Even in the United States, there's been some university dorms, and we're going to find, I'll show you the website where that stuff's at, that didn't have CO detectors. Somebody thought they were, somebody assumed that thing on the ceiling was a dual CO smoke detector, and it was not. But remember, don't trust anybody. If somebody says, oh yeah, that thing up in the ceiling is CO and smoke detector, grab a chair, stand on a chair, and take the cover off and see if it is. Then sometimes smoke detectors are mistaken for CO detectors, right? I mean, somebody will say, that thing in the ceiling does both, and no, it only does one. That happened to one of my students one time. After hearing one of my lectures, she went home, grabbed a chair, took the cover off the detector on the ceiling, and it was only a smoke detector. Called the landlord. He came over and goes, oh my gosh, I got to change all these for all the apartments in this building. Again, don't trust anybody. Sometimes at these places, the staff is totally unaware of the toxicity of CO and the dangers. They don't understand the biology and the 250X factor. And pretty sad. There's been many cases where people have died in hotel rooms, and it's crazy. And I'm going to show you a site that you can read some of those actual cases. Then in resorts and hotels, there might be episodic release of CO by equipment heaters. Because if a water heater isn't heating up the water much, it's already got the temperature and it's not being used, then it's going to, and even if it's malfunctioning, it may not put out a lot of CO. But what if it's shower time in the morning and everybody's showering before they check out? Those water heaters are working at their max rate, and they're putting out a maximum amount of CO if they're malfunctioning, or if the venting is wrong, or the owner of the hotel had their brother-in-law route the vent for the pool heaters, all kinds of cases. So episodic means sometimes up, sometimes down. It's not with any set rhythm. It depends on what's being used. Did a bird build a nest in the vent? Yeah. So you can check out a whole hotel one day for CO, find nothing, and the next day you can have somebody die because a piece of equipment had malfunction between the time it was checked and the time the next day. So malfunctions can occur at any time and place. That's what makes detectors so important, because nothing else really works better than that. Then I've got an example coming up of changes in airflow in rooms. And remember, CO will follow wherever the air is moving. Into a room, out of a room, up a chimney. If there's downdraft in a chimney, then the CO is going to come down the chimney or stay down in its source. And then guests may not spend much time in the room until night, so they don't really get like that dizzy thing. They've been out enjoying their vacation, which you should, but they don't realize there's no detectors, or the detector's not working. And that's why you're going to see at the end here, I'm going to say you must travel with detectors. You just must. Okay, here's a little diagram that I'm quite proud of. I did it in paint. Remember, I'm artistically impaired. I have no artistic ability. But I've got a hotel room here, labeled on the bottom, and there's 5 people staying in the hotel. There's a door over here, of course. There might be a window. And then my blue squiggly lines represent vents, air vents. So here's one over here. There's one over here. And then this one is next to the room that contains a big hot water heater that all of a sudden malfunctioned and something broke in the heater and it's spewing out CO. Unbeknownst to anybody in this room, of course, right? A lot of times you don't even know what's in the room next door. Well, I'm going to show you with my red laser pointer the path of air currents that could be. And remember, sometimes air is supposed to be flowing in, but it might be flowing out. Anyway, I'm going to assume up here that this is a malfunctioning water heater with the vent. All these people represent, they should be in bed right now. They are. Pretend they're sleeping. There's a vent here, of course, and a vent here. So now if there's fresh air coming in here, and this is, let's say this is the exhaust vent. So everything is pulling out this way. Well, if there's air coming in here, look at the red line. Maybe under the door, there's air coming from the hallway. But if this is CO and it's a slave to the exiting air here, air is going to be pulled in through here, past this person, and then go out this way. And that's going to occur all night, perhaps, in my example. You know, there's a million of these examples. Well, my point is, this person is going to be exposed to this CO all night long, whereas these people will probably not, because remember, CO is going to follow air currents. It's not going to just seep in here and fill up the whole room. No, it's going to be a slave to the air drafts. And this person could die or wake up feeling sick, and everybody else is not. That's my example. Now, I'm just going to make a few comments on detectors, but you can do your homework. Always read the instruction manual that comes with the detectors. So there's many, many available. You go to Home Depot, Walmart, and you can pick them out. I'll tell you what I prefer if you live in a home where you have to plug one into the wall or whatever. Some are hardwired different places. But anyway, to me, the best household detectors have a digital readout, and I've got an illustration of one. And the readout is in parts per million, never percent. And then it plugs into the wall outlet, and then it has a battery backup. Because just look at in the news how many power outages we've had. Sometimes hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. And if it has a battery backup, even if the power goes out, you're still going to be able to detect CO. And then it should have these 2 buttons, which I'm going to talk about. It's reset, test, and then one that show you a peak value that's been detected. So like in newer homes, I bet you there's hardwired and Just got to make sure it's working. Never just trust one detector. But I do want to make a point, and I will in another screenshot. All household CO detectors have a lag time. Their response time is not immediate. And that bothers me. I know why they do it. They don't want a lot of false alarms, but I'll show you, examples here coming up. And then most recommendations down here at the bottom is CO detectors should be placed on every level of the house and then in bedrooms. And you might say, oh, that's kind of expensive. Well, you talk to somebody that's lost a loved one, their loved one has died from CO, and you might say, oh man, it would have cost me $400 to put them all in the house. And that person will look at you and think you're crazy, that you're going to worry about $400 when that person lost a loved one. Okay, so now I want to talk about that lag time. I call a lag time. I think in the brochures they call it response times. And they make them so, look at this. The sensor will not alarm to levels of CO below 30. So in your house, if it's 28 parts per million, you'll never know it. That bothers me. I don't want to live in a home with 28. Especially if you're like a stay-at-home mom or dad. Your pets are always going to be exposed to that. Let's say it's 28. I'm, getting close there. That bothers me, but I know why they do it. They don't want a lot of false alarms. And then they'll alarm in this following range. And what this means is if the detector senses 70 parts per million, it's going to take up to 4 hours for it to send off an alarm. That's what this means. The reason they do this is, let's say you have a detector near a living room that is attached to the indoor garage, and you shut your car off and a little bit of whiff of CO comes into the house, and it might hit the detector at 70, and if it was totally responsive, like in real time, then it would alarm and you might be alarmed. So, but still, I wish these response times were shorter, but I know why they're doing it, but you'll see how I get around this. So then if you have 150 parts per million, the response time is less. And as you see, as you go up in parts per million, the response time goes down. That's how they're programmed. So 400, it's going to alarm you in 10, 15 minutes. That's going to get you out of the house. So a lot of these will get you out of the house, but you might be sick before then, right? But then here's a neat thing. They are now selling smoke and CO detectors. A lot of times they're combo, but maybe they might be singular too, that you hook up to your router at home. And you can have push notifications sent to your phone in an app if something goes wrong. Or on that app, you can just check each room where these detectors are at. They're identified individually. So like you can have basement, laundry room, first bedroom, second bedroom. And you can do this from any place in the world. So that is neat. The other thing about these push notifications are not only can it tell you, but then you can tell the app to send the notifications to your mom, your dad, your relatives, your wife, your kids, whatever. If you're a student at college and had one of these, and you're in class taking good notes, of course, well, your mom might get a alert along with you that something's going wrong in your apartment and you've left your dog there. Okay, so then another thing is that the detectors can be all linked. So if one detector is activated, and let's say you have 6 in your house, all 6 will alarm. That's fantastic. Because maybe you have one down deep in the basement storeroom and it's alerting, but if you're on the second floor bedroom, you may never hear it. But these detectors will all set off, and you can program that they all will tell you which detector is activated. Like the one in your bedroom might say basement, basement, I'm not sure exactly what they say. I've got about 3 of them now, so I'm going to check it out myself. But that's a big step forward, and it's amazing. They're not that expensive, really. Um, so, wow, I think I'm going to call it a game changer, but a lot of people will not put them in, I'm sure, because they're unaware of how dangerous it is. Okay, I just picked out these images to show you the type of household detector I like. I'm not promoting any brand. There's so many out there, but remember my liking has a digital display, has 2 buttons, one to test and reset, and then one that's got a peak level. If you press this, if you had a peak level of 500 last night, it'll show up here. And that peak level will continue showing until you reset it. So let's say it had 30 or let's say 50 last night, then you can reset it, and then if you reset it and hit peak value, it'll still read 0 until it gets better. Some of these can be linked Wi-Fi, but then I remember the response time. That response time I showed you on that chart goes for all these detectors that are normal household detectors. The exception is industrial detectors don't have that response time. This is one I use. This company, I'm not promoting any companies, but SensaCore, I talked to them the other day. These can be brought on carry-on in airplanes, and they're neat. They have an on and off button. So when you take them on your airplane, you shut them off because detectors, if they're on, they don't like to be in suitcases. So this one, you'd have to take the battery out. Otherwise, it might start alarming in your carry-on baggage because it's not breathing. This one breathes up here. This one breathes down there. But you can shut it off, but it also will tell you the max. But this one has a visual, of course, a display. It also is audible, and then it vibrates. And some of them, I don't think it's this one that's waterproof, but some of them are waterproof. And the response times, look at this, 5 to 20 seconds. Isn't that better than that one that had 4 hours at a certain level? So these are great. They're not made to alarm the house. They're made to alarm you. You can clip them on your body. You can have them by your nightstand. But the response times are great. And once you got it turned on, the dial is gonna read out real values. It might be 2. It might be 3. It might be 4. It might be 20. It might be 100. And so the professional ones are great. I have them because I don't like the point about the response times that are so long in these others. So now I got some suggestions when you travel, whether you're in your own country, traveling to foreign lands. Here's what I do and all my friends do, because if they don't do this, I send them the detectors. So you take 2 home style type detectors along that have a battery backup. If you go to a country where it doesn't plug in right, then you have the battery will work. Just take some extra batteries along. Because I don't like just one. So then if I was traveling in a hotel, I would plug in one by, maybe the TV, and then I would plug one into the bathroom. And then I would take one industrial type detector along that works in seconds, check out the room when I get there. I don't have to wait 4 hours for an alarm. I get feedback in seconds, and it's going to read in real time, and then I'm going to have that on the nightstand right beside the bed. Or I might wear it with me the whole vacation. They clip on. Maybe the cab you're in has a high level of CO, and the driver doesn't know it. So all these things can be taken on carry-on, because I did check with that one company, and their salesmen carry it on all the time. But like I said, you should take the batteries out of the home detectors because there's no off switch. So they're not going to like being in a carry-on baggage. They might be alarming, and then be embarrassed that just says, oh, that's my detector. The professional ones have an on-off switch, so you just shut those off when you're on the airplane. And finally, I just put this up for making sure you remember where you can find additional information. Remember to search the web for the human symptoms of CO toxicosis. There's a lot. That table I had was pretty good. Then you can search the potential sites. But then here's something that if you really like this stuff and want to learn more about it, you go to this site that I've got listed here. You're going to have to probably type it in your browser by hand. I don't think when I make a MP4 file, at least I don't know how to make it work if you just clicked on it. But this is an organization that keeps track of actual cases in all 50 states. They don't keep track of cases in other countries, but it'll list it. They'll list it chronologically. So they start every new year, like 2025 here. They start listing things for January, February, March. Now it's April, and they just go on. And most of the links go to like newspaper articles about them. And what's really informative is you can see the circumstances, like the 5 people that 2 adults and 3 kids that died about a week ago from right now. The power went out. They put a gas generator in the house someplace. I'm going to, let's say, assume a basement. Maybe they thought, well, it's a basement. CO is heavier than air. We're going to keep everything down here. But you remember, CO disperses every place. And then you can read the circumstances. And then there's hotels, and there's pool heaters that malfunction, and somebody was sitting in their car, they're homeless, and the woman and her 3 dogs die in the car because they were trying to keep warm and they didn't have a detector along. Those professional detectors you can take in your car. They're all, self-contained. The household ones you can't. Well, I guess if they're battery operated, but they have such a long lag period. There's nothing better than those professional ones. And of course, yeah, sure, they cost $150 to $200 perhaps, the ones I buy, the professional ones. But talk about peace of mind. And then once you read that site and how many people are dying every year, the estimate is between 500 and 1,500. That's a lot of sorrow. In my hometown, I don't know, was it 3 years ago, my hometown in Minnesota, a family of 7 died. And the CO detector was one CO detector, that's all they had, was found in a drawer. Crazy. Okay, well, I had to have an ending slide, so this is the end. And then I ran into this image of 2 dogs the other day, and I thought it was so appropriate, and I'm a dog lover, so this is another way of saying I'm a dog lover, and a lot of happy days with those guys, except for one.